Welcome back to the RPC podcast. I'm Redirected. We have with us Osmi Mzulu, Red Curious, and our guest speaker, my little brother and aspiring wife coach, Praxology. On this episode, we will be answering questions such as, how can you be more interesting? What is riffing? Would Jesus take the corona jab? And more. Let's get started with you, Prax. How can I be more interesting?
Having an opinion and not sucking at telling stories would be a good way to start.
Does the opinion have to be a good one?
I was really hoping you would just come on here with some really rancid stuff.
Just wait.
Get the whole thing canceled. Definitely say having a well thought out opinion is a great way to start. We're not talking about like how people get really into trains and you're thinking about how does a steam powered train or a steam powered engine run over 18,000 miles.
But really, guys, like if the car lobbies didn't ruin the railroad system, where would we be in the world? I mean, come on, think about it.
No, nobody wants to hear about that. But we're talking generally opinions on how people interact with other people. That's an easy thing that pretty much every time I start talking about something in that realm, other people are very interested in it. Having just stories backlogged, either jokes on demand or things that you can basically use to kind of off the cuff bring energy to a gathering or a...
Here's the thing. We are people who partly defined by just our substance, who we are, and we're also partly defined by our experiences. So if you want to be a more interesting person, have more interesting experiences. I think that it's going to be really hard for the guy who spends all of his time playing Call of Duty and going to work and coming to home, going to bed, maybe hitting the gym 5 times a week or something like that. And that's kind of the rinse routine. You're going to have a probably hard time coming up with a very interesting persona because you're not doing anything interesting. There might be elements of that have a degree of interest, but I think we tend to run into this problem, especially in the modern West under the crushing demands that are this current economy. Essentially, people don't have the time or don't make the time to do interesting things. They're not interesting. I would really encourage anybody who wants to get out there and have more energy to bring to a conversation or a more magnetic persona is do things that are outside of the ordinary. And I think people want to hear about that because they're not doing anything outside the ordinary anyways, and they find it unpredictable and somewhat inspiring as well. So go travel, go pick up a new hobby that's difficult or just something that people don't normally do. And I think those are all things that are going to help make you a more interesting person because you have actually become a more interesting person.
So tell me this though, have you guys not ever been around somebody who seems to have lots of friends, they seem to be the center of attention, but you hang out with them and you just find them boring to death, but for some reason everybody else loves them, right? Because to some degree, you have to recognize that different people find different things interesting. I knew one guy who was my neighbor. I personally did not find him all that interesting, but he was at one point ranked 3rd in the world in World of Warcraft. There was a ton of people who found him to be one of the most interesting people to talk to, and he had all these fascinating things to them to say. I did not connect with it. I've never played World of Warcraft, never really cared for it. There was a niche audience that really loved hearing about him and how he plays and his life experiences, home setup, all of it. There's a degree of knowing your audience that affects how interesting you can become. If we talk about, you got to be, really charming and charismatic on this or that. Well, if you're not really hanging out with a charming, charismatic crowd, yeah, you could potentially up your interest factor by doing that. But there's a whole other subset where you could be that guy at the gym who's lifting weights and super powerful, and then you walk into a certain crowd and nobody gives a crap.
I think that what you're touching on there is going to be the either breadth of appeal or the depth of the appeal. If you think about any hobby out there, there's going to be a group of elite people or people who are otherwise well established in that and know their thing, their craft, and they're going to be super interesting to anybody who's also interested in that craft, whatever it may be. So back to the model train person. Yeah, I'm sure there's probably like 5 guys out there on YouTube who are like the gods of model train. And if you're into that hobby, those are the most interesting people to you, at least in that capacity. But that's not going to give you breadth of appeal. And sure, maybe somebody's going to want to hear a little bit about, hey, I randomly met this guy who's really good at this one weird narrow area, but it's not going to give you a breadth of appeal. It's going to make you, on the whole, a more interesting person, at least beyond that subset. Yeah, if you have some area that you're very either expert in, which allows you to get into that depth of interest, or if you're somebody who otherwise just has a lot of exposure to a particular niche, great, that's awesome. Back to like the powerlifting example you brought up. I don't really care if I'm interesting to other guys in the gym. It's cool if they want to talk. I don't really care if they find me interesting or not, because I'm not really there to make friends and, you know, be an influencer in that capacity. That right now I work out at home, so that would be very not productive of me.
All right, so I'm going to steal the MC moment from you for a little bit, Matt, and just ask, what is the value of being interesting? Why do we want to be interesting? Is there an end game to all of this?
Yes, to entertain yourself.
It's kind of what I tried to conclude with that post that I put up on Reddit recently. The more socially affirmed you are, the better you interact with people on a public level, the more you are going to be able to advocate for your mission. I mean, whether you're one of the secular guys whose job is just to get as much tail as possible, or you're somebody who wants to interact with people for the purpose of spreading the gospel, you are going to be giving yourself more opportunities and more tools to do either of those things.
So it comes down to being effective for your mission then, right? So if you're interesting, then you're effective. We haven't really had that many concrete examples of how to be interesting other than have an opinion, have stories, have jokes, have a personality. But what else can I do?
Before answering some of that with, I guess, some more practical examples, I do want to just touch on what I said briefly, which was so that you are entertained yourself. I think part of it is, if you aren't entertained with your life circumstances, or if you're the narrow hobby guy, if you're not entertained by those things, it's very long odds that anyone else is going to find you entertaining anyways. So I think that there is a type of mentality that goes out there with these disingenuous motives to, I'm going to go, okay, I heard Oz talk about being more interesting by doing more things, so I'm going to go hiking, and I have no interest in that, and so I'm going to go on a hike with some friends. And they do it out of a place of wanting the end but not enjoying the means, and I don't think that's going to be successful in the long run, or probably not even the short run either. So I think that
right, we call that living out of your own frame. You're living in somebody else's frame because you're at that point trying to appease everybody else through what you do.
I think that's the wrong way of going about it. So I think that in part, if you are doing things that are interesting to you, and you may not know if something's interesting to you or not until you try it, but even so, there's a degree of self-service there that I think a lot of people, especially people in the church, find a bit off-putting. But I think that it's not a bad thing. People ought to pursue the things that God has placed on their heart to be interested in. I think we've been created with more in our repertoire than going to church on Sundays and grinding out 40, 50, 60-hour weeks for Global Homo Corporation. So have at it. As far as very practical things to be more interesting, back on the idea of being interested in yourself. If you're having a conversation with people, there's a mark where a really good conversation that's really interesting is when the other person is having fun with it and you're having fun with it as well. And so I think that sometimes the goal of the conversation gets conflated or gets confused, where people are trying, I need to be interesting to this person. Well, can you have fun and have them have fun with you? And that means that opens up everything. You can talk about whatever or nothing and nonsense. And if it's a good conversation and people are having fun with it, you will be interesting to them, because it's rare for people to be able to have those conversations that are genuinely a joy to have.
Let's be more concrete. Let's say you walk into a new church, a small group. You don't know anyone there. There's 10 people. How do you present yourself as someone that's interesting? How do you work a crowd?
I personally will walk up to someone and ask if they believe in Sasquatch.
Dude, you totally just stole my answer.
That reminds me of my when I was in college, I used to have this thing where everybody would walk around saying, "Oh, hey, what's up? How you doing?" Just to screw around with people, would say, "Hey, you like Jell-O?" And it was just this awkward, bizarre thing that, yeah, it painted me as this weird person, but it also caught people's attention and it started conversations. And the same thing was just with the way that I would dress. I was the guy who wore shorts all year round during the winter, even in college, no matter how much it was blizzarding outside. And it turned out that people were talking about me and knew me. And I was, for some people, I was that weird guy. But for the most part, as soon as people like actually had a context to come where I was able to engage with them, then all of a sudden it's like, "Oh, you're that guy. Yeah, I know you." And all of a sudden we're chatting, and it's easy to roll into things, and it's immediate conversation start. "Why are you wearing shorts when it's so cold out?" And then I have, whatever reasons I wanted to come up with, I could give to them. Stupid things like that, of just being the guy out of the box who is asking bizarre questions or doing bizarre things, or, peacocking to some degree.
When I think about this, as far as how do you work a crowd, how do you put yourself out there in a new group, I think one of the things is tease people. What you're doing is you are, one, it's more interesting because most people don't start there. And so who's this new guy who's making us laugh and teasing us and maybe even pushing it a little bit where it's almost a little bit of making fun of? I think that people don't quite know how to respond to that. And in a good way, it makes you stand out, and they're forced to evaluate you. If you're being genuinely a helpful and nice person too, it's so that the way they can kind of give you the benefit of the doubt if you're pushing things a little bit too far with that. But I think, yeah, teasing people, finding something funny and running with it, even if it's a little bit at their expense, because I think it makes them have to evaluate you. And if you can give them other reasons to evaluate you favorably anyways, it's going to make you stand out pretty quickly.
And to some degree, you're describing what we'd call having an amused mastery in a situation. I would say an actual mastery in a situation also makes you interesting. And I think we've alluded to that before, but you specifically bring up the context of a small group, right? Usually I spend the first maybe 2 to 4 meetings of a small group just getting to know people, listening, observing, so I can figure out what the feel of the room is. But at some point, once I have a picture of what it is that they're striving for, if I can show that I have a mastery over that concept, something that they want, or that they wish that they could be like me in this area, then that gives me an opportunity to become interesting to them because I have something to offer them that they care about. And so at that point, it's just a matter of starting to speak up and gradually demonstrate that, not through words of like, hey, just so you all know, I'm the smartest guy on this or that, or I know how to do this, or I'm really skilled in this area. No, you don't want to puff yourself in egotistical ways, but you can, through your behaviors and consistency and congruency between what you say and what you live, demonstrate to people, I've got this down. That brings an automatic interest.
Yeah, I would just caution guys, you have to do that in a way that doesn't make you look like a complete douche. So there's this guy who he's very vocal about his accreditation. He's got a PhD now, and everybody has to know about it. In his PhD studies, he came to a small group and he was the new guy there, but he had to make sure everybody knew that he was the smartest guy in the room. And it was interesting because he came from a different theological tradition and didn't really know what we were talking about in some cases. And so it came off extra cringy because he didn't really have a mastery of the subject. But it would be these weird name drops of professors that nobody ever knew. Or when I helped co-write this paper with so-and-so, we talked about this subject, and it just came off as this really, really cringy neckbeard fedora level status thing. And sometimes he would have good things to say, but you could just kind of watch the air get sucked out of the room every time he'd open his mouth, because everybody's like, okay, here he goes. He's going to try and flex on us about how great of a degree he has or is working towards. So don't be that guy.
Right. Like I say, you don't want to be the guy who self-puffs. You want to be the guy who's able to demonstrate it. And you do it not through a, hey, look at me, but a watch how it's done is kind of more the approach that I would take.
It's called having Asperger's. I think Prax called that out in his post.
I'd like to be the guy that self-puffs, but I need to get a couple of ribs taken out.
I gotta ask, this is RPC. We're all married men. If it's a Christian group or not, are you guys flirting with the girls?
Yes, but I pretty much flirt with everyone. So that doesn't really change my demeanor in any kind of considerable way.
Is she hot?
Well, it's a group, so, women look hotter when they're in a group. Who knows?
Well, I mean, if they're there, I can't, it's just, what am I supposed to do?
How do you define flirting? I had that conversation with somebody on RPC early on. I essentially took the viewpoint of flirting is really just enjoying conversation and feeding energy off of each other, right? As Prax would call male-female energy exchange. And so to some degree, any interaction with somebody of the opposite sex or who you could potentially have a romantic interest with could be defined as flirting. And if that's the case, then sure, people flirt all the time. I have no problem with flirting. Am I intending it to go anywhere? That's a different question. Usually, I shouldn't say usually, most often not.
I think in this context, I define it as being intentional, making eye contact.
I would say definitely. So an example of this, in high school and still, I'm friends with a lady who, she was Mormon. And so there was never going to be any interest there romantically, mutually. But she's very attractive and we hung out all the time and we were really good friends. And the idea, by the way, that men and women can't be friends, there's a lot of truth in that, but I wouldn't say that's a complete 100% all the case sort of thing. We knew there was never anything between us, but we always would flirt anyways. And even now, we're both married, and when we all hang out as a group and as couples, we still give each other a lot of crap and tease each other and flirt and that sort of thing. It's just such a natural extension of our friendship that it has never been weird. I think there's a way that people can make things weird, but to what Red Curious just said, if there's no intention of it going anywhere, that kind of diffuses it anyways. Honestly, it's just, are you having fun with this person? Are you able to get a rise out of them? Are you able to push them a little bit? And I think people are so sterile in their interactions that it honestly bores me to tears watching other people interact a lot of the time, because there's this weird barrier of, oh, I don't want to push things too far or offend them or something. And people are just walking around like zombies, wishing that somebody would do something entertaining.
So the conversation that I'm recalling specifically, I heard the argument, if it is not intended to go anywhere, then it's not actually flirting.
So is that our definition of flirting then?
I don't know. What is our definition of flirting?
There is no definition of flirting. It just depends on the person. But not everyone's on this program. Why do we think it's okay as Christian men to flirt with other women?
Why do I care what most other men think?
Oh, there you go.
I mean, I say that somewhat brashly, but in all sincerity, there's not been a lot of demonstrable evidence that Christian men have any of this figured out worth anything anyways. So given that experience and my observations, it doesn't seem like they're able to flirt successfully with one woman, including the one that's married to them. I don't really care about what their opinions about flirting are in general.
But Oz, you're married. Why would you want to flirt with another woman?
Because it's fun. I find it entertaining. So do they. So does she, by the way. People are so sterile about these things, and it's really off-putting in a way. And I think there's a degree to which someone who's accustomed to having, I'm using flirtatious in a very general sense, but having a very flirtatious persona about them in relationships with people, they walk into a church building and they see this like weird side hug culture going on. And it's kind of like, do you just like think everyone's poisonous around you? Do you all have bad breath? What's going on here? I don't know. I could see it as an outsider being a very off-putting thing anyways, because you can see almost like tangibly reach out and touch this bizarre artificial barrier that's kind of encapsulating every conversation of propriety. I don't see it. I don't see it as a thing that's necessary. I don't see it as a thing that's helpful.
Well, Prax, you'd never flirt with a girl because that means your wife might flirt with another guy, right?
I mean, okay. Big bummer for her. She's going to flirt with some weenie.
I think what you're trying to say is, who cares if your wife flirts with someone else?
I'm still thinking back actually on being awkward hugging other guys and our definition of flirting. So Oz, I'm just curious then, would some men interpret the way that you have fun in conversation with them as flirting with them in a world where we no longer have sexual boundaries between the genders?
No, I think when you look at what passes as a degree of flirting between guys, you see more of, at least when I was growing up, you saw more of this guys constantly riffing on each other and low-key hazing each other all the time and trying to get a rise out of one another that way. Yeah, that's more of what's going on there. It's funny because when I think back on some of the guys that I have lifted with and otherwise we're pretty close with, you have the craziest conversations with them, and sometimes they get into like bizarre territory, but like generally speaking, it mostly comes down to you're trying to kind of low-key one-up one another, but not in any real sincerity at that point. No, if they're confused about that, then I guess sucks for them because I'm not available.
You guys ever out like at the mall or something and you see another dude and you make eye contact and you're like, man, I could be that guy's friend? Is it just me?
No, I mean, like, I have a pretty high bar when it comes to people that I want to spend time with. I rarely see other people and think, oh, you know what? I think it would be great if we hung out, because I guess I'm just not that impressed with other people. And so I have a pretty high bar for them to qualify themselves to me. And now every now and then I'll see someone who's doing something interesting and say, it would be really cool to go hang out and do that with them. But as far as the actual person behind it, yet to be determined in most cases. And also, Prax, yes, I know you thought we had something special, your private message here. I'm going to go ahead and just air it out there. I'm sorry, man, we're breaking up. I'm doing it on air. It's pretty bad form, but, here we go.
I was going to say, have you guys never had a bromance?
Oh, I've had one or two.
I think we already have a bromance in this podcast right now, if I'm not mistaken.
Moving on.
Well, okay, hold on. I want to take this point with a little bit of seriousness, in the sense that if you look at ancient historical texts, guys had friendships that were really close. And you have this new LGBT professor academia that's trying to pervert history and turn everybody into a closet homo back in the day. And that probably just got us banned on YouTube, but I don't care. There was this very strong affection that you found between men in most of the ancient world, and relatively common going forward from that until essentially the last century or so. Now with this whole imposing of this giant LBGT, buzzsaw agenda behind us, it makes every guy's relationship to a degree suspect at that point. And in a way, it's a way of subverting male closeness. And it, I would say, disenfranchises men from being able to consolidate power. And that is what they want to do, is to stop fraternity. And if you notice, every fraternity down to the Boy Scouts has been essentially demolished, because the last thing that any kind of power structure wants is men to be able to organize together in a way that they don't control. The whole bromance idea, even the concept out there, which is really just a strong male friendship, has been somewhat co-opted by even using those terms. And I'm not like ragging on anyone for using those terms. I use it too, but just there is a lot of upstream attendant baggage with that guys ought to fight against and recover and have strong male friendships.
So let's get real. Could you guys see yourself having a Jonathan David relationship with someone?
Define. I mean, for our listeners out there.
All right, Jonathan David. Anybody want to take that one?
So Jonathan and David, that's Old Testament. They were just super, well, not just, but they were super, super close, to the point where Jonathan basically betrayed Saul by going behind his father's back and telling David that he was going to get murked.
Right. And we see these very emotional type of words that are used to describe the way that they interacted and loved each other and the passion that they shared. We see them, sneaking out behind the castle together to spend time together when Saul was against David. So it is interesting to see that type of bond happening. I could understand how some people would misperceive that into a homosexual type arrangement, but I definitely don't see that anywhere in scripture.
If you see that, if you go through that story and you look at that relationship and you come to the conclusion that, well, they must have been gay, I think what you have done is you have demonstrated your lack of ability to see the depth of male friendship that used to exist as a relatively common phenomenon. Again, if you look at the Greeks, and I'm not talking about those Greeks, but if you look at a lot of the Iliad and some of the other major works that were back then, you still had a very high degree of closeness between a lot of the male characters that today would make a lot of guys uncomfortable. So I think it says more about us than it says about them.
Right. The degree of camaraderie that existed in most of history prior to the rise of homosexuality, or especially the fear of it, is really something beyond what we can comprehend in our modern lenses that we approach things with. I look at, even in New Testament passages, Paul talks in Philippians saying words like, "It is right for me to feel this way about all of you since I have you in my heart." And he talks about how much, I thank my God every time I remember you, and all my prayers for all of you, I always pray with joy because of your partnership in the gospel. But he uses these very emotional, joyful, bonding, passionate words to describe how he feels about people. And there's nothing wrong with having feelings toward people. As much as I fight against emotionalism in the church, the push against it is not against feeling. It's against making decisions based off of your feeling or using emotions as a judge of somebody's spiritual maturity. But the reality is that we are meant to have these strong bonds, right? Jesus talks about being one with us, and in us being in him and him being in us. Does that sound homoerotic? Sure, it can. And in fact, there's a lot of comedy sketches out there that are great that talk about our worship songs that use these types of language.
But I hope you're using the term "our" loosely there, because
yes, I very loosely. I will say that I am definitely not a fan of modern worship, but that's a conversation for another day.
All right, guys, I'm going 4 deep in my hard seltzer, so hold me back.
Oh boy, things are about to get real interesting.
All right, Prax, this question's for you. What is Mayor Game and how do you do it?
Mayor Game, when I hear it and the way I've seen it worked out, is basically being able to work a party to the point where you are not only flirting with girls, however we wanted to define that, you're working the entire room, and that you're bringing an enormous amount of enjoyment or satisfaction. Or like some guy critiqued my post yesterday, hurt my feelings, and he said that the energy was a pseudoscience. So I'm just going to say he's a spurg. It's just energy. You're bringing the energy of the entire thing up. Screw that guy, though. Whatever. But
I'm just reading the comment right now. I'm going to vote it just to trigger you more.
But just bringing the vibe of like a social gathering up, and then being able to interact with people in a way that not only advocates for you and whatever mission you're pursuing, but you're also able to help others get enjoyment out of their own social interaction. I do this on lessons when I'm teaching. I have a motto. Whenever I'm working with a couple, I will always wingman for the guy to his wife. I'll say things like, all right, we're going to play a game where you have to do this with your dog, and you get points, and the person with the most points wins. And I will always cheat and have the guy win. And then what they get is a back rub at the end of the night. And the girl's like, nah. And I just wink at the guy, and we have this like vibe going on, and she's all happy because I don't know. That's just
very, very, acute analysis there.
right.
High marks for technicality.
Yeah, no, I just
When it comes to that, I'm just going to go back to, I think when we talked about how to it was essentially how do you make connections, friends, relationships. We had a podcast to that end. And in it, I really advocated that guys learn the art of hosting a party. And I want to double down on that in the era of COVID. You should definitely be hosting more parties and bigger parties. It's very important that you do that for everyone's sake. But that little civil disobedience aside, what's really interesting when you're hosting a party, you're necessarily playing mayor game and everybody expects you to. And if you aren't playing it well, everyone knows. It's not that you might or may, you may play mayor game or you may choose not to. It's you're playing and you're either losing or you're winning. So I think, again, I'm going to pitch, go host parties and learn how to do that. And you'll necessarily, if you want to have good parties, you're going to learn how to connect people and how to improve the mood of the party. And I would actually go so far as to say that what your goal is when you're hosting a party has nothing to do with individuals insofar as it has to do with the party itself. You actually have almost another being in the room, if you will, and it's called the party. And your job is to go around and you're supposed to feed the party as much energy and good vibes as you can. Speaking of good pseudoscience. And if you do that successfully, everyone's going to have a good time because they're connected to that party. And you've been there. You've been to parties that, hey, wow, this party has low energy. It kind of sucks. I wish, somebody would do something about it. Or, wow, this party's great. And if you actually think about what's going on, it's objectively horrible. But for whatever reason, people are really enjoying themselves. It's because the party is really strong. It's been fed well. And so I think it's really, if you can get that down, then you've pretty well nailed the majority of what mayor game entails, at least when it comes to a social setting and where you're expected to be that person.
I mean, usually I'm the one hosting parties. That's kind of the norm for me. And it's not even just parties, but even when we go out and it's something that's going on in a group setting, it is the definition. I mean, I was just reading while you guys were chatting, Jack 10's original comment describing the whole thing. The mayor, the guy who's not trying to run game, but instead he's just mingling with everybody, telling funny stories here or there. And as soon as he sees a lull in one conversation, he hops in and livens it up again and then moves on. And that's usually what I do. No matter where I'm at, whether I'm hosting the party or attending somebody else's, it's just a matter of finding what needs to be livened up. And so this is the difference. And I think this comes into a lot of humility-based issues with people say, oh, the red pill's all about, just self-puffing and boasting and arrogance, and there's no humility here. But in reality, mayor game is one of the best ways to express that because you're not trying to make yourself the center of attention. It's not like you're saying, everybody come listen to me and hear my stories and laugh at my jokes. Instead, you're going around participating in what everybody else is doing, empowering them, building them up. And that's really the whole function of my mission, right? My mission to make disciples is that I'm not out there drawing a crowd to myself. And I'm really here to empower other people and send them out into the world so they can build things of their own. And so when it comes to the way that I express that, I mean, I guess I'll cut myself off there before I go way too far.
When you look at the mayor game, in a way, you can kind of look at it a little bit like a tribal situation, if you will. So a chief is kind of running the tribe. The tribe actually doesn't exist. When you really think about it, the tribe is just a concept of the collective kind of agreement of people's personalities and ideas and whatever. The tribe is that collective entity, but it doesn't actually exist. Similarly, when you're in a social setting and you're playing mayor game, the party or the atmosphere or whatever it is that you're in, it doesn't actually exist, but everybody feels either more or less connected to that. And so your job is to connect everyone to it and strengthen the areas that are weak. So the person who's enjoying the party the most will enjoy it more if the person who enjoys the party the least enjoys it more, if that makes sense. Like, you need to be working the entire thing to strengthen the whole. And so I would look at it to a degree as you are, again, trying to collectively improve everyone's connection to that. And on the same side, pruning those things that aren't working. So in the same way that if you have somebody who is, a nutcase and he's ruining the situation, it's your job to get rid of them in some way, shape, or form, or otherwise get it under control. And if you don't, it can ruin the whole thing.
So that kind of brings me to my next question, which is conversations, specifically riffing. This is something that a lot of guys do naturally, where you go back and forth, you make jokes, you make fun of each other. I don't think it necessarily has to be a guy on a guy, or it doesn't matter.
He's advocating for not guy on guy. I did hear that clearly.
You got me. Hey, there's a riff right there. See, he did it. Same thing when you guys were talking about bromances, or when you're saying you're breaking up with John. That's a riff, and that's something that's rare to find anywhere. I mean, if you're at a party and someone starts riffing with you, you're probably going to make friends with him. Is that a skill that you can develop, or is that just something that people have innately?
A little bit of both. I think in the sense that some people are more innately gifted in that way. I know some guys who were just absolutely charismatic to a crazy degree, and they could pretty much win over anyone by riffing with them enough. Other people, I think it comes a little bit less naturally because they don't know how far they can push it. And so either they don't push it at all and they don't even try riffing. And so they're kind of, sequestered to themselves. Or on the flip side, they don't have that understanding that they can push it too far and they can't read that other person's boundary. And then they just come off like a total jerk, and they're not being winsome or riffing, they're just being a douche. So I think there's a degree of calibration that can enhance your ability to do it.
And I think if you want to be an interesting person, that's something you have to be working on. If you're not good at riffing, start working on it. Start messing with people. Find another person that you can ping pong off of. It's not only fun, it makes you interesting. It makes you cool.
I would even say among guys, if you can't do that, then you're only ever going to be surrounded by weak guys with no standards. So if you ever expect to be a part of a group of men who have standards and who are going to be good influences and be otherwise useful in your life, you're going to have to be able to learn when to take it and also learn when to dish it out. And if you can't do that, again, you're only guaranteeing that you're going to be around low quality guys more often than not.
Question also reminds me of the law of the lid, which I don't know if anyone's ever read anything by John Maxwell. He has a book called The 21 Irrefutable Laws of Leadership. The very first law in his book is the law of the lid, which explains that everybody has certain leadership potential. And just to put it on a scale of 1 to 10, Bob's natural innate leadership ability might be 3, whereas Alex's might be 7, right? And it's possible that Bob, with incredible hard training, could push himself from a 3 to become a 7 like Alex. But Alex, with a little bit of training, could bump his 7 up to a 9, right? And so there's always going to be a hard cap where, because of his innate ability, Bob will probably never be a better leader than Alex. It's possible that he could train himself to become better than Alex's innate ability, but Alex will always have that higher cap. And so I think what we're talking about here is that there's some guys where they just innately have it and others who don't. And you can learn it and you can improve and work on it and become proficient and have it become second nature and natural to you. But at the same time, you have to recognize to some degree the law of diminishing returns that's also going to apply in some of these principles of how much are you going to have to work on it. And is it something where you say, I'm going to take the easy gains and then move on to other things where I can actually play to my strengths?
Going back to Prax's post, you talk about people becoming the heel. Can you expound on that a little more?
Yeah, so the heel is the butt of a joke. Whoever the you is, the people watching this video, if they watched the one where we were with Horns of Apathy, and they were doing a kind of a gag, Chuck and Horns were doing a gag on me about having a scruffy beard. That's because I haven't hit puberty yet. Being the heel is being the butt of a joke. Being good at being a heel means that you're actually good at taking the joke. You can be a heel and not be good at taking the joke. I'm going to show my age, but JVP I was listening to something he was talking about today about some guy that he worked with that they made fun of every day, and the fun escalated to people throwing stones at the guy's head because he couldn't take a joke, and he would just like freak out and be a spurg about it. Being a heel, if you can be effective at it, you can amplify other people's jokes, and then you just pass on that title to somebody else who is also able to take it. You're also suspending your ego for a moment. So if somebody wants to call me a very mean name, call me poopy head, then okay, that's like whatever. I'm not taking it as a personal attack, and a lot of people do. Another example of this, you'll have groups of people where there's always some lady in the crowd, and it'll be like some Mexican guy and some black guy, and they're making racial slurs at each other, and then some Karen steps in and she gets offended for one of the groups, and it's like, well, neither of them are even upset about it. Why are you superimposing your weird, awkward anxiety and being offended on this? And then they usually just end up making fun of her. That's why Karens are the perfect target, because they're easy heels, but they can't take it. So you just get to watch them spurg out.
I think it's important, I would say, to remember when you're talking about heels is picking the right heel when you are the one doing the joke giving. That is a problem that I made a mistake on a lot. I'm known as a practical jokester. It's one of the things that I just have so much fun doing. And especially when I find a gullible person, oh, it's so easy and humorous. I remember when I was on staff at the Navigators, one of our team members was incredibly, insanely gullible. And so she went to a football game for the university that we were stationed at with a bunch of the students in our ministry. And the football team won. And she was there. She watched the entire game from start to finish. And I remember her coming back to our housing unit, and I was able to persuade her. I'm like, oh, it's so sad that they lost. I couldn't believe that. It was so close in the last quarter. I didn't even watch the game, but I could just like see how upset she was getting. And she's like, I know, it was such a horrible defeat. And it's like, you were there. But what struck me is that at some point in all of the times that I had picked on this insanely gullible person who would believe just about anything I said, is how it affected her in a way where she was not able to receive it as a healthy heel who could say, oh yeah, I can take a joke with grace. But instead, it really started getting on her nerves. And at some point I had to figure out, if I want to have influence in people's lives and to be able to have a healthy relationship with this person and not have it negatively affect my reputation with others who see me doing this, I have to figure out how to tell jokes appropriately and how to pick the right people to pick on.
How far along are you in your Gaslighting 101 post anyways? I've been meaning to ask. So thoughts on being the heel. I think it's one of those things where, there's this idea out there in Red Pill, never self-deprecate or otherwise stand up for yourself kind of idea. And people talk, get really weird about some of these particulars around that concept. I don't necessarily agree that it's never okay to self-deprecate. I think part of it is a matter of, are you being believable or not? It's really weird when somebody who is overweight starts like gently poking at and then sometimes firmly poking at the fact that they're overweight, and it's not really done in a funny way, and it just makes everybody really awkward. On the flip side, I've known some guys who were substantially overweight who were very winsome, and they were making no bones about the fact that they were overweight, and they owned it well. And so I think that there is a degree to which there's a way that you can do it that is neutral at best, and you're kind of just airing out the elephant in the room and putting people, at ease because, hey, yeah, this is the reality we're all dealing with here, and here's a funny way of talking about it. And there's a way of doing it that is like you're trying to cover for an injury, and people can sniff that out really, really quickly. So when people self-deprecate over something they're insecure about, it almost never works out well.
Right. I feel like if you want good examples of that, Owen Cook, I've seen some of his YouTube videos where he is able to take the fact that, he's somewhat of a chubby, balding guy, and yet go out in the pickup community and have no issues. And he just owns it, right? He accepts it. This is part of who I am. It's my makeup. I'm not going to let it get me down. I'm going to portray an attitude of confidence in all of that.
Right. And I would say on the flip side, if there's something that's really, really obviously positive about you, self-deprecating over that can be pretty funny and pretty winsome. If there's a guy who's obviously really, really athletic and is, very fit, and he makes fun of himself for all of his bad health, unhealthy habits or whatever, something along those lines, and people can visually see that what he's saying is clearly not commensurate with reality, that there is ways of doing that can be pretty funny and pretty winsome.
I'm going to make a generality here, but I have a question.
I'm offended.
Why does the church make boring men?
All right. So the intellectual in me immediately hears that question and thinks, before we get there, because actually there's probably more the attorney in me, that's a leading question. Are churchmen boring in the first place? I don't know that we've established that. If we take that on assumption, I guess we can go forward.
Let's take that on assumption.
I think the church is making boring men, and the way that they're doing it is there's a reason there's a mass exodus in the church that's happening. And the guys that are not leaving are usually the guys who they can't kick it with other men, so they're trying to kick it with the single moms or with their own moms. And most of those guys are the traditional soy boy. You start trying to riff with them and they take it personally. Or you make like an off-color joke or something that's like a racy joke, and they're like clutching their pearls. And that's a trait that I see in a lot of the guys are my age that go to church, or that are like not go to church, but like are actively part of like the churchianity.
I would say that generally speaking, yeah, a lot of guys in church are really boring. And I think that there is a degree of a question there. Is it a matter of selection bias, or is it actually a production problem? And it can be both. So is a church more attractive to boring guys because it gives them something safe to do, that they can feel like they're participating in something that doesn't cost them much of anything? So yeah, I think that there's a certain degree to which the church is a comfortable place for such men, in a way that I don't think has always been historically the case. Secondly, I do think the church does produce boring guys, because I think, generally speaking, most of the guys who are running churches, pastors, elders, however you slice it, tend to be pretty boring guys too. And so they're probably not going to lead boring guys into being more exciting guys if they're themselves pretty boring.
You know what I've noticed is the women aren't nearly as boring as the men. You can riff with the women. You can flirt with women. You can make jokes, and they'll riff back with you. But the men, I don't know. I hate to generalize, but I feel like they're dead in the eyes about 70% of the time.
There's a lot of gatekeeping that happens among guys, and in this bizarre, like, hyper purity spiral thing that happens where, so part of, I think, being friendly and interesting and having a good conversation with a guy is pushing boundaries a little bit. And, you know, if you're going to riff with a guy, there's going to be a degree of transgressiveness involved in that. And I think that there's this thing where if you say something a little off color, there's this want to white knight about your political correctness or your language or whatever it is that you just stepped a little bit over the line. And I've seen that from a lot of guys, especially older guys in the church, where if you make a joke that's a little bit untoward toward women or something like that, you know, even if it's relatively tame, all things comparatively, there's going to be this reaction that tends to happen where it's kind of like, hey man, that's an unkind and unchristlike thing to say. You might want to reconsider that. And sometimes spoken, sometimes not, but I see the pumping of the brakes in a conversation when things like that happen. And I think that that really puts a cap on how interesting you're going to be when you've really kind of defined a pretty narrow lane of conversation.
And one of the things that strikes me in the question is that I remember growing up thinking church is boring generally. I mean, the reality is that, yeah, you sing a couple songs that are not really the kind of songs that I would normally want to listen to at home. And then you might hear a guy talk for 45 minutes, if you're lucky, half an hour, and then you all go home. And so if the idea of church is, and just growing up thinking this is boring, I know my kids have told me, even in the children's church where they try to do lots of fun and games and activities and crafts, it's still boring. And so there is a selection bias of the people who are most likely to stick with it are the people who are most likely to be okay sitting through boring things, right? And then there's the other avenue of the production concept of what Oz was talking about. What you have in your end target vision of what you're trying to create or produce, or what your long-term goals are, is going to determine what you produce along the way to get there, right? So if your long-term goal is Jesus, but your picture of Jesus is a boring picture, then that means you're going to create boring people as you try to get them to Jesus. Now, the reality is, you know, he is the lion and the lamb. He is the Alpha and the Omega. He is big, small, he is God, he is human. It's really hard to encapsulate all that. And there's nothing boring about Jesus. And in fact, he was so interesting. The book of John says that not even all of the books in the world could contain the number of things that he did. And yet for us to be able to take this view of Jesus that oversimplifies into these meek and meager lessons for, you know, here's a principle to go on for your week, without understanding and encapsulating the full picture of who Christ is and trying to embody all of his attributes and instead only those which seem to be culturally pleasing, and those which particularly are culturally pleasing in a way that makes men boring and pacified, that is going to produce boring men.
Yeah, I think that's an important point. And I would even just go so far as to say the church has a strong tendency to choose the most boring parts of the Bible to focus on. There's a lot of really interesting stuff that is way worth reading and considering, and you never hear the church by and large talk about it.
And as soon as you get the church to even start talking about some of the interesting things, then all of a sudden they have this allergic reaction where they just start vomiting out hate against whatever it is that you're bringing up.
So what do? We're going to go to church and just be bored all the time? Is that what we're relegated to?
Just bring up like a water gun, and every time someone starts talking and they bother you, just spray them with it.
So
Spray 'em with what?
holy water, duh. I think to a degree, First of all, find the most interesting church you can find. And there are some that are led by pastors that are much more interesting. There are several of the elders in my church who are very interesting people, and I'm very thankful for that. That said, I think there's also, you can have interesting conversations and push the envelope with people in the church and see where it goes. And you can select for yourself, to a degree, other people who are going to be worth fellowshipping with, and that does create some upward pressure on the church to move the needle, so to speak. So I don't think it's a lost cause necessarily. I think there are plenty of churches that are lost causes, and people should get the hell out of there as quickly as possible. But there is more than likely at least a conservative-ish church, and I mean, I'm using conservative in not totally obliterated by postmodernism, church somewhere nearby you, and it will probably afford you more interesting conversations and teaching and the rest of it.
The only thing that I would add to that is I think that most people already know my position is you're not going to find that perfect church out there. To some degree, you're always going to have problems, especially if you're trying to look for something mainstream, not niche, right? You could probably find a couple house churches here or there if you really, really look for them. That might be more up your alley. But the reality is, in the mainstream, something that's sizable, that's going to have things for your wife and kids to do beyond just your own interests. At some point, you're going to have to embrace the fact that the mainstream is the mainstream for a reason. They're all alike. There's going to be all churches are like that qualities. So in that, I would be more interested in what I've seen become effective with the last few places I've been, is just to attend for the purpose of saying, I have something that I need and am looking for, and if I can't find it in the wild, I'm going to make it myself.
I think there's something also worth considering here too, is that the majority of mainstream churches, they're not going to exist within the next couple decades. They're falling apart at the seams, and so there's going to be a reckoning. There already has been. I mean, COVID has basically eviscerated the church in my area, and there's only a handful of them that have even kept their doors open, let alone not seen major drops in attendance. Whereas a church I go to has, I think, got record attendance now because they stayed open and people realize that, hey, that actually might be important, and they're willing to push the envelope where it needs to go. So I think that what we're going to see is we're going to see lame, lukewarm churches going away and shutting their doors, and that's going to put pressure on churches that are remaining to be more interesting, because the people who value that sort of thing are going to be the ones going to that church. And I think there's going to be congregational pressure to dig deeper. Plus,
I hope desperately that you are right. I just don't see it happening.
I would go so far as to say it's an inevitability.
I do think that we will see a larger chasm between the large and the small, that the middle-sized churches are going to start faltering, and you're going to see a lot of small startups, and then you're going to see a lot of large mega churches. But I think that we're going to renormalize at some point. And it's, as much as I hate to say that, my hope and dream for when COVID happened was, I was thinking to myself, yes, this is finally a situation where institutionalized church is crumbling apart, and we can get back to the root of what Jesus would call the mission of the church, rather than the structure of the church being the emphasis. And instead, all I heard was a flurry of voices on the internet, in newspapers, in real life, just crying out again and again and again, we want our Sunday services back. Give us our Sunday services back. And there was nothing about trying to fulfill the mission of the church. It was all about give us our structure back. And I think there is such a push for the love of the modern structure of the church that we're never going to get away from that. And even as much as we have seen COVID obliterate things, I do believe it's going to rehomogenize itself.
I think I would disagree with calling meeting on Sundays a modern structure, but to the degree that this has not forced a lot of churches to reimagine themselves, as you say. Here's the thing. You're in a much more conservative area than I am, and this whole country is moving leftward. In a much more liberal area, in a much more left-leaning area in general, the churches that exist here are basically one of two: rebels and capitulating leftists that aren't even Christian. And it's those capitulating leftists that aren't even Christian that they don't even have a message to other people on the left at this point. And so they're crumbling, because if you're a postmodern leftist, individual autonomous snowflake, why would you go to church anyways? And so there aren't mega churches here anymore. The one that was in this area, the longest, is down to like 30% of the attendance that it had been. The only churches that are still operating in any capacity are conservative churches, in any capacity that matters, at least. And the ones that are still trying are either so deeply compromised that there's no distinction between them in the world, or they've already shut their doors. So I think as your area becomes more liberal, you will see more of this.
Before I close us out, I wanted to read a couple of user submitted comments. First one from Seltzer Keyboard 11 for Oz. Oz, what did you do for a living before you changed jobs?
Oh boy. So I worked in corporate America. I'm trying to think of how specific I can be. I was working in relatively high level retail, and I'm using that term broadly, management. So I had worked both in-store high-level retail management as well as in warehouses as operational management. Teams of multiple hundreds of people, several executive leaders all working under me. I had a stint in HR, and now I'm doing something that's more related to that, but involves more computers and people, which has been, frankly, a breath of fresh air.
Interesting. Second question from Microphone Water 2. Oz, why are you so secretive about your past?
I wouldn't say I'm secretive about my past. I would say I value privacy, because once something is out there, there's no reining it back in on the internet. And so I tend to be pretty selective about the information that I put out there, less for my sake, more for my family's sake. And I would say I'm fairly pessimistic about the direction of this country and the West in general right now, as we see the negative effects of totalitarian policy intersecting with technocratic governance. It doesn't bode well, and it's one of those things where I try to keep a pretty light digital footprint for those reasons. As things have continued to get worse and worse in a privacy standpoint, I feel fairly vindicated in that.
It's because he's in a gay adult film. He doesn't know that.
I'm actually the 50th shade of gray, if somebody was wondering.
Okay, last question is for Prax, and this one is from Barfyman 2020. Barfyman asks, my wife just told me I love you, but I'm not in love with you. I think she may be seeing another man. I started snooping on her phone and went as far as pretending to leave the house and hiding in my backyard to see if anyone comes over. Yesterday morning, while hiding, I hear a car pull up 15 minutes after I supposedly leave. My question to you is this. When the car pulled up, my dog started barking like mad. What can I do to make him stop barking at cars?
Good question. Has he tried hitting them? I hope that's real.
No, I made up all those questions, by the way. I just want to know what Oz did.
Man, I was hoping there were people out there that were actually taking an interest in some of these things, but...
Bro, the username was like Seltzer Keyboard 11 and Microphone Water 12. Come on, guys.
Those are real.
Okay, in fairness to me, the first name, that could be any Reddit name out there. But to hear one that's almost the same exact name, come on, Prax.
Harpy Water.
Arthie, man, come on. You got...
All right, well, here, I got one from John Saxon for you, Redirected, and you know what he says?
With that, thank you guys for joining us on this edition of the Red Pill Christians podcast. Please like and subscribe, and we'll catch you next time.
We're watching
Later.
you, John Saxon.
Thanks, guys. Catch you later.
Catch you guys later.